They won't tell you this, but people don't follow who they love. They follow who they cannot afford to ignore. You've spent your life trying to be understood, to be liked, to be approved. And where has it left you? In rooms where your kindness is mistaken for weakness, where your patience is the cue for their exploitation. The truth is uncomfortable. Affection makes you familiar, and the familiar is always devalued. But respect, especially the kind that hums just beneath fear, commands a different silence. It doesn't beg, it doesn't persuade, it simply exists and forces the world to adjust to it. You don't need more friends, you need more boundaries. You don't need louder words, you need quieter. Power that doesn't chase attention but draws it. Power that doesn't demand but is instinctively obeyed. This is not about cruelty, it's about clarity. You must become the presence that no one dares to test, yet no one desires to destroy. The one they speak of carefully, not out of affection but out of awareness that even proximity to you has consequence. And if that makes you misunderstood, good. You were never meant to be explained, only felt. Now ask yourself, do you want to be liked or remembered? 1. The illusion of affection. Somewhere along the line, you were convinced that affection is strength, that being liked is a sign of power, that approval builds security. But it doesn't. Approval is fleeting and affection is fickle. What people admire today, they question tomorrow, and what they once praised, they eventually expect. Affection is not a foundation. It is a temporary shelter, and often the first thing to collapse when pressure arrives. You learned to be agreeable, that is, inking it would grant you peace. You kept your tones soft, your boundaries vague, your demands minimal. You hoped that if you inconvenienced no one, they would spare you discomfort. But life doesn't work like that. The world isn't waiting to reward the pleasant. It waits to test them quietly, systematically, to see just how much they'll allow before they break. And when you do break, the sympathy will be brief. Then they'll move on. Not because they're cruel, but because people are trained to respond to power, not to kindness. They may appreciate softness, but they remember strength. The truth is hard to digest. Affection does not guard you, it exposes you. When you become known for being flexible, people push. When you're always available, people stop valuing your presence. What they can access too easily, they stop protecting. So while you're busy being agreeable, they're learning where you'll bend, how far you'll stretch, and when they can step over you without consequence. And they will, not because they hate you, but because you've taught them there is no cost to doing so. You need to understand this. Respect begins where tolerance ends, until you show that there are boundaries, clear, consistent, non-negotiable. Your presence will be taken for granted. The more you try to earn affection, the more power you give away, not in grand gestures, but in small moments. The apology you didn't owe, the silence you kept to avoid conflict, the favor you granted out of fear of being misunderstood. This doesn't mean you must become unkind, but it does mean you must stop performing kindness as a defense mechanism. Because real influence is not built on being liked, it's built on being considered, on being factored into the equation, on being the one whose response cannot be predicted, whose silence means something, and whose presence alters behavior in the room. That doesn't happen when you're overly understood. It happened was when you're carefully regarded. Stop trying to be lovable. Start becoming undeniable. Not through aggression, not through ego, but through the refusal to be easy to access without cost. Let affection come if it must, but never build your strategy around its approval. Love is earned, then lost, then earned again. Respect, once properly constructed, does not require renewal. It persists, and that persistence is what protects you. 2. The architecture of measured fear. Fear has a reputation it doesn't deserve. It's spoken of as corrosive, toxic, oppressive. But that's not the kind of fear we're talking about. We're not discussing terror or tyranny or humiliation. We're speaking of something more sophisticated, more precise. The kind of fear that builds structure, the kind that deters without degrading. This fear does not shout, it doesn't parade. It exists in how people pause before they cross a line you have drawn only once. It's in the way they hesitate before speaking casually to you, even when the conversation is light. It's in the recognition that there's something about you they cannot read and would rather not test. This fear does not arise from force, but from certainty, from consistency, from the knowledge that when you say enough, you mean it. And if they ignore that, the outcome is no longer a conversation, it's a consequence. You don't have to explain it. In fact, you shouldn't. Every time you explain your boundary, you reduce its weight. Every time you justify your firmness, you surrender a layer of authority. Instead, let the consequences speak. Let them learn through result, not rhetoric. This doesn't make you cruel, it makes you clear. The ones who fear being hated avoid consequence. They overcompensate with kindness. They deflect confrontation by blurring the lines. And in doing so, they create environments where disrespect is inevitable. Because no one fears misbehaving when there is no cost. You must become the kind of leader, the kind of presence that teaches through gravity. Your boundaries are not requests, they are facts. They are not up for debate. They are known and, more importantly, they are enforced. Not with rage, with finality. The moment people sense that your limits are firm, they will begin to behave differently. Not just around you, but in the way they think about you. You become someone whose present CE forces them to calibrate, and that calibration is the first sign of power. Because when people must adjust to you, you are no longer simply included. You are central. This is not about scaring people into silence. It's about guiding them into awareness. And awareness builds a different kind of respect. One rooted not in fear of punishment, but in the knowledge that your tolerance is not infinite. Your silence is not submission, and your approval is not given by default. The ones who understand this will become your most loyal, not because they adore you, but because they trust you to remain exactly who you say you are. They trust the line you've drawn, and in a world of constant contradiction, that trust is rare. Let your firmness become a compass. Let your restraint become its own language. And above all, let them know, without ever needing to say it, that you are not someone they want to provoke just to find out what happens next. 3. Authority is not given. It's managed. Authority isn't something you receive. It's something you sustain. Many believe it's granted through titles, recognition, applause. But in truth, authority doesn't reside in what people say you are. It lives in how they behave around you, in how much they hesitate before speaking, in how little they assume about your limits, and most of all, in how easily they forget themselves in front of others, yet never in front of you. You can be crowned, praised, positioned at the head of a table, and still not be the one in charge. Because authority is not a symbol, it is an atmosphere, a cultivated perception, a psychology that must be curated, maintained, and sometimes disrupted, just to prove it still belongs to you. The greatest mistake leaders make is assuming that power, once attained, becomes permanent. But power fades the moment it's taken for granted. The minute others begin to predict you, they begin to doubt you. Predictability is the erosion of command. If they always know how you'll react, they stop adjusting. And when they stop adjusting, your influence dissolves. What must remain constant is not your method, but their uncertainty. Not fear of harm, fear of miscalculation. You must become the variable they cannot account for, the presence that interrupts assumptions, not through chaos, but through design. Subtle unpredictability forces respect because it creates psychological distance. The unknown breeds caution, and caution breeds restraint. When people feel they've figured you out, they stop listening. When they believe they understand your boundaries, they test them. But when your silence stretches unpredictably, when your responses are timed not by habit but by intent, they begin to step more carefully. Not because you control them directly, but because they're no longer sure what crossing you entails. That's control, and it's invisible. You don't need to issue threats. You don't need to hover. You only need to demonstrate that your authority is not assumed. It's chosen. And every choice you make reinforces the idea that you are still the one directing the room, even when you say nothing. There is a difference between being present and being watched. Make sure they feel both. When your authority starts to feel too safe, you lose it. The most effective leaders reset that perception periodically, a silent withdrawal, a correction issued without drama, a refusal to engage where everyone expected you to react. These are the small, deliberate disruptions that keep your presence sharp. Don't aim to be feared constantly. That dulls the edge. Aim to be respected unpredictably. Keep your rhythm unreadable. Say less but mean more. Be known not for what you repeat, but for the effect your rare interventions create. Because in leadership, consistency comforts, but unpredictability commands. 4. The price of ascension is solitude. Power isolates, not in theory, but in function. As your influence grows, your company shrinks, not because you push people away, but because your elevation demands distance. The air thins at the top, not just metaphorically, but relationally. What most fail to understand is that power requires space. Space to think clearly, space to observe without interference, space to act without the burden of others' emotions clouding judgment. But with the that space comes a silence many can't bear. They call it loneliness, but it's not. Not in the usual sense. It's clarity. You no longer speak just to be heard. You no longer surround yourself to avoid emptiness. You begin to listen not to respond, but to discern. And that subtle change makes many uncomfortable. Because your detachment is interpreted as arrogance, your quiet as judgment, your self-sufficiency as coldness. Let them misunderstand, because attachment creates vulnerability. Emotional dependence weakens vision. When you care too deeply about being understood, you begin shaping your decisions for approval instead of necessity. And in leadership, the necessary is often unpopular. Great leaders aren't immune to feeling. They're immune to being directed by it. Understand, the more influence you hold, the more others will feel entitled to shape your choices. They will appeal to loyalty, to friendship, to past connection. But if you bend every time someone invokes emotional currency, you'll soon find yourself bankrupt in authority. Leadership isn't about pleasing those who remember your beginnings. It's about protecting the structure you've built, no matter who helped lay the first bricks. And with that protection comes a form of solitude only the decisive can endure. You'll be accused of changing. You'll be told you've grown distant. But the truth is, they're reacting not to who you've become, but to who they can no longer influence. You haven't changed. You've clarified. The strongest decisions are often made in silence, alone behind closed doors, with no applause and no one to affirm them. But that's where power solidifies, away from performance, away from sentiment. You don't need company to validate your leadership. You need distance to protect it. 5. Mastery lies in restraint. Real strength doesn't announce itself, it doesn't raise its voice, it doesn't fight for attention. It simply waits, and in the waiting, it sharpens. Most people assume power is shown through action. The louder you speak, the stronger you are. The faster you respond, the more in control you seem. But in truth, those who rush to assert themselves reveal something else entirely: insecurity. A need to be noticed, a fear of being misunderstood. That's no T-power. That's panic in disguise. Restraint is different. It's deliberate. It's calm. It doesn't need applause. It creates a quiet tension, the kind that makes others second-guess what you're thinking, precisely because you haven't said it yet. This isn't silence for its own sake. It's silence with weight. When you don't react immediately, people start to anticipate your reaction. They begin adjusting their behavior, not because you force them, but because they're unsure what your next move might be, and that uncertainty, that's your leverage. The predictable leader is easy to navigate. The restrained leader is hard to read, and what can't be read can't be manipulated. When people stop knowing how to move around you, they start moving more carefully. You don't have to control everything. You only have to control when and how you enter. A single well-timed word is worth more than a dozen rushed explanations. A delayed decision made in silence often strikes with more clarity than one made in the heat of the moment. Because what you hold back becomes valuable, and what is valuable becomes powerful. Stillness is not weakness, it's strategy. Restraint doesn't mean inaction. It means refusing to act on someone else's timeline. It means watching people reveal themselves while you say nothing. Let them speak too much. Let them expose their hand. Your silence becomes a mirror, one they can't look away from. In that mirror, they see their own impatience, their own need for control. And slowly, they realize the one who isn't speaking is the one who understands the room best. The greatest influence comes not from reacting, but from choosing not to. When you respond to everything, your authority becomes thin. But when you choose your moments, people learn to listen, not out of habit, but out of caution. They begin to recognize that your words carry weight, not because they're frequent, but because they're rare. Don't always correct them. Let them learn through misstep. Don't always clarify. Let confusion do its work, and when you do intervene, let it be brief, decisive, and unmistakable. That's how restraint becomes remembered. You're not trying to be feared. You're teaching them that your patience is intentional, that your silence isn't weakness. It's warning. That just because you haven't responded doesn't mean you're unaware. And when the moment comes to act, you won't need to raise your voice. You'll only need to move once. 6. Know their weakness. Guard your intentions. Power is never truly about force. It's about perception. And perception is built not by exposing your strength, but by recognizing theirs. The most effective leaders don't dominate the room by sheer presence. They dominate by understanding exactly what everyone else in that room is protecting. Desire, fear, insecurity, vanity. Everyone has a fault line. Most will spend their lives hiding it. But if you observe long enough, you'll see he tremors, a glance too quick, a word too defensive, a pause where none should be. These are not accidents, they are data, and leadership, when executed masterfully, is data applied with precision. But here's the caveat. While you map their weaknesses, never reveal your own. Keep your ambitions obscured, your emotions tempered, your opinions rare. Let them guess at your true objectives. Because the more they speculate, the less they act. And in that gap between uncertainty and assumption, you control the narrative. Mystery isn't a luxury, it's a defense. When people know too much about you, they begin to calculate how to move against you. When they know too little, they hesitate. They plan, but without confidence. They second-guess. And that pause, that slight delay, is often the only edge you need. Clarity should be a privilege, not a right. Let your enemies speak often. Let them show their hands with conviction. You, on the other hand, should speak only when the silence becomes heavier than your words. Because each time you speak, you are giving away part of your mind. And the more predictable your mind becomes, the easier it is to target. You must learn to treat information like a weapon. Collect it, sharpen it, use it only when necessary. And most importantly, never offer it in return. You'll be tempted, especially when trust is offered, especially when praise is given. But remember, those who seem open may simply be trying. to pull you into the light so they can see where to strike. Gratitude is not always sincere. Curiosity is not always innocent. Even admiration can be a form of reconnaissance. Guard your silence like a fortress, and when you must act, act in ways no one expected. Because while strength wins battles, unpredictability wins obedience. People don't fear what they understand. They fear what they might provoke. Your intentions must always seem just beyond their reach, close enough to feel, yet too far to grasp. That way, even when you're absent, their behavior bends toward caution. The moment people feel they've decoded you is the moment you start to lose your influence. Because once the mystery dies, the myth dies with it. And without myth, power becomes ordinary. Ordinary power doesn't last. 7. When to tighten, when to let go. Power is not constant pressure, it is rhythm. To lead well, you must know when to tighten your grip and when to loosen it. Most believe dominance is about control, but control applied without pause becomes suffocating. It breeds fatigue. It pushes even the loyal toward escape. The most effective leaders understand this. People need room to move, room to fail, room to return. You don't secure loyalty by holding on too tightly. You secure it by making people aware of what your absence feels like. Let them act without you. Let them stumble. And when they do, don't rush to save them. Observe. Let reality instruct them on what your leadership prevents. That lesson will sink deeper than any lecture ever could. Then, when you return, not with scolding, not with wrath, but with a simple reappearance, they will recognize the stabilizing force you truly are. That recognition won't come from fear, it will come from contrast. The contrast between their chaos and your control. There is a difference between being indispensable and being oppressive. Learn it. Use restraint not only with your reactions, but with your presence. If you're always the answer, they'll never feel the question. If you're always the voice, they'll never learn to listen. Step back, not to disappear, but to deepen your impact when you step forward again. Leadership is not about catching every mistake. It's about letting the right ones happen, so the right lessons are learned. When someone disrespects your boundary, you don't need to crush them. Often you need only to remove yourself. The vacuum that follows is more painful than confrontation and far more educational. It teaches that your attention, your direction, your protection, these are not guaranteed. They must be earned. But there are also moments where leniency becomes neglect, where allowing freedom becomes tolerating dysfunction. In those moments, you tighten, not with anger, but with exactness. You reassert structure, you clarify what will and won't be accepted, and then you let go again. This push and pull is the art of strategic tension. Too tight and they'll rebel, too loose and they'll drift. But when you calibrate correctly, something remarkable happens. They begin to self-regulate. They begin to manage themselves, not out of fear, but out of respect for the system you've designed. Your power begins to replicate itself. In your absence. This is the difference between leadership that endures and leadership that collapses. Those who tighten too often exhaust their teams. Those who let go too soon lose their footing. But those who master the tempo, the balance between command and space, build something more than control. They build culture, and culture, unlike fear, does not need to be enforced. It spreads, so observe closely. When they're learning, step back. When they're drifting, step in. When they're lost, let them wander, just long enough to crave direction. And when they ask for it, don't over-deliver, offer just enough to make them hunger for more. Because in that hunger, they'll find you again. And this time, they won't just obey you, they'll follow. At the edge of every command lies a question. Do they obey you or merely tolerate you? This is where most leaders fail, not in decisions but in delusions. They believe loyalty is earned through goodwill, that influence is a matter of charisma. But people don't follow what's charming. They follow what's certain. And certainty does not come from popularity. It comes from precision, the ability to act without apology, the discipline to be unreadable, the wisdom to resist explaining yourself when silence is more powerful. In the end, power is not what you do, it's what your presence prevents others from doing. It's in the glance that stops betrayal before it begins, in the stillness that silences defiance, in the distance you keep, not out of arrogance, but necessity. Understand this. True command is not in domination, but in restraint, not in being feared loudly, but in being respected so deeply that no one wants to find out what happens when they cross you. You are not here to be loved without limits. You are here to be respected within them. And the D, you stop seeking permission to be powerful. That is the day you become untouchable. Choose wisely and lead accordingly.